Singapore's rise feels unreal. In barely half a century, a country with no oil, no minerals, and barely any land transformed itself into one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. Today, the average Singaporean earns more than the average American. But rewind to 1965, and the story looks completely different. That year, Singapore was in free fall. It had just been forced out of Malaysia. The island had no natural resources, no farmland, and no strategic depth. It was smaller than New York City. Unemployment was soaring. Tensions with neighboring countries were high, and there wasn't even a real army to defend itself. Every problem imaginable seemed to hit at once. During one emergency meeting, a simple question was raised. Which crisis do we fix first? The answer was shocking. All of them. On paper, it sounded impossible. Yet somehow this tiny island would pull off one of the greatest economic comebacks in modern history. But to understand how Singapore escaped disaster, we need to go much further back. For centuries, Singapore was nothing more than a quiet fishing settlement. No grand cities, no major influence. Just boats, water, and silence. That changed in 1819, when a British official named Stamford Raffles arrived. He looked past the swamps, the heat, and the disease and saw opportunity. Others warned him the island was full of pirates and mosquitoes. Raffles saw something else: location. Singapore sat at the narrow gateway between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Any ship traveling between Europe, India, and China had to pass nearby. It wasn't just land, it was leverage. Like owning a toll booth on the busiest trade route on Earth. Under British control, Singapore exploded in growth. Immigrants from China, India, and across Southeast Asia poured in, chasing jobs and stability. The population skyrocketed from a few hundred people to hundreds of thousands. The port buzzed with trade, money, and movement. Singapore became one of Britain's most valuable Asian outposts. Prosperity followed, though, to be fair, it benefited the British most. Then came the shock. World War II reached Asia, and Japanese forces advanced rapidly. British commanders were confident. Singapore, they believed, was untouchable. Massive coastal guns guarded the island, huge naval cannons designed to tear enemy battleships apart. The defenses looked overwhelming. No one imagined how wrong that confidence would soon prove to be. The British commanders were relaxed. Those massive coastal guns could tear a battleship apart like wet paper. From their perspective, any enemy attack would come from the sea. If the Japanese Navy showed up, they believed Singapore would crush it. Then came the warning. "Sir, they're not coming from the sea." Confusion spread through the room. That didn't make sense. Everyone knew armies couldn't move through dense jungle. It was considered impossible, too thick, too wet, too hostile. They're coming from the north or through the jungle. Silence followed. Moments later, reality hit. The impossible had already happened. In February 1942, Japanese forces captured Singapore with shocking speed. What was supposed to be an unbreakable fortress collapsed in weeks. Winston Churchill later called it the worst military disaster in British history. The British had prepared perfectly for the wrong threat. Their defenses faced the ocean. Their guns pointed outward, but the island's northern side was dangerously exposed. That single blind spot changed everything. Confidence turned into catastrophe, not because Singapore lacked weapons, but because it misunderstood where the real danger was coming from. And that failure wasn't about strength. It was about assumptions. The British assumed the enemy would think the same way they did. They assumed the jungle was protection. They assumed impossible meant safe. They were wrong. That lesson would echo decades later, when Singapore faced a very different kind of threat, not invading armies, but economic collapse, political isolation, and national survival. Once again, danger wouldn't arrive from where people expected. And once again, the cost of ignoring blind spots would be enormous. But this time, Singapore would respond very differently. During the Japanese occupation, life in Singapore became a nightmare. Food was rationed, fear was constant, and tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives. The occupying forces renamed the island Sayonanto, meaning light of the South. But for the people living there, those years felt anything but bright. The occupation lasted more than 3 years. When World War II finally ended in 1945, British forces returned to retake control. On the surface, it looked like things had gone back to normal, but beneath that calm, everything had changed. The myth was broken. Ordinary Singaporeans had watched the so-called invincible British Empire collapse in days when Japan invaded. The illusion of absolute protection was gone. If the British could fall so quickly, why should they still rule? Quiet resentment turned into a clear demand: self-government. British officials hesitated. They doubted that a small island with no resources could survive on its own. But the locals had already survived years of occupation, shortages, and terror without help. Independence no longer felt unrealistic. It felt necessary. Singapore began moving towards self-rule, but geography made everything complicated. The island was tiny, densely populated, and mostly ethnic Chinese. Surrounding it was Malaya, much larger and predominantly Malay. As Britain prepared to withdraw from the region, it searched for a solution that would keep things stable. The proposal was simple: merge them. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaya along with Sabah and Sarawak to form the new nation of Malaysia. On paper, it made sense. Singapore would gain access to land and natural resources. Malaysia would benefit from Singapore's economy, port, and expertise. At first, it looked like a win-win, but reality hit fast. Malaysia's central government favored policies that gave special privileges to ethnic Malays. Singapore's leader, Lee Kuan Yew, pushed for a different vision: equal treatment for all races in a shared nation. That idea clashed directly with Malaysia's political structure. Trust eroded. Economic pressure followed. Tariffs were imposed on Singapore. Political arguments spilled into the streets. Racial tensions exploded into riots, and lives were lost. The union became impossible to hold together. In 1965, Malaysia made a stunning decision. Parliament voted to remove Singapore from the Federation. Overnight, Singapore wasn't just separated, it was expelled. No resources, no army, no hinterland. Just a small island suddenly forced to stand completely on its own. For many, it felt like a death sentence. But for Singapore, it would become the moment everything truly began. We'll survive on our own. That was the reality Singapore was forced to accept. On August 9, 1965, Singapore became an independent country. The moment was historic, but it wasn't celebrated. When Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew went on television that day, he broke down in tears. Not tears of victory, tears of fear. Lee had spent years trying to keep Singapore inside Malaysia. Being expelled wasn't freedom, it felt like abandonment. In his mind, independence wasn't an opportunity. It was a potential death sentence, and the facts supported his fear. In 1965, Singapore had no natural resources. No oil, no minerals, not even enough fresh water to sustain its population. There was no real military. The island was surrounded by much larger neighbors who viewed it with suspicion. Unemployment was high, racial tensions were fragile, and the economy relied heavily on British military bases that could shut down at any time. By any normal measure, Singapore wasn't supposed to survive, but Lee Kuan Yew refused to accept that outcome. He understood something critical. Singapore had one and only one strategic advantage: its location. Ships were still moving through its waters. Global trade still passed its shores. If Singapore could transform itself into a world-class port, a commercial hub, and a financial center, survival might be possible. But before chasing prosperity, the country had to solve its most basic problem: water. Singapore depended heavily on imported water from Malaysia. That meant survival could be cut off with a single political decision. If the taps were turned off, the country would literally dry up. So Lee made water independence a national priority. Reservoirs were planned across the island. Rainwater would be captured, stored, and reused. When land ran out, rooftops became part of the solution. Every building would collect water. Drainage systems were redesigned. Nothing would be wasted. And then came the boldest idea of all: turning seawater into drinking water. At the time, desalination was expensive and inefficient. Many believed it wasn't realistic for a small, poor country. Lee didn't care. If the technology didn't exist yet, Singapore would develop it. Survival wasn't optional. Innovation wasn't a choice. Failure simply wasn't allowed. And this was only the beginning. The next threat was economic collapse. At the time, much of Singapore's income came from British military bases, but Britain was already planning its withdrawal. Once those bases shut down, thousands of jobs would disappear overnight. If Singapore didn't act fast, unemployment would explode. The country needed factories, industries, jobs. Here's where Singapore made a decision that went against almost every developing nation of the 1960s. Most newly independent countries chose self-sufficiency. They raised trade barriers, protected local industries, and kept foreign companies out. Lee Kuan Yew looked at that model and rejected it immediately. Singapore was too small. It lacked land, raw materials, and domestic markets. Self-reliance wasn't strength, it was isolation. So Singapore did the opposite. Instead of closing its doors, it opened them wider than anyone else. The goal was simple but radical: become the most business-friendly place in the world. Corruption would not be tolerated. Government processes would be fast and predictable. Taxes would stay low. Contracts would be enforced. Laws would be clear and fair. Foreign companies weren't treated as threats, they were invited in. Singapore positioned itself as a bridge between East and West, a place where global firms could operate safely inside Asia. Critics mocked the strategy. Other countries accused Singapore of selling out its sovereignty. Lee didn't care. He believed results mattered more than opinions. If Singapore succeeded, the criticism would disappear on its own. Then came another crisis: housing. Most Singaporeans lived in overcrowded slums, densely packed, unsanitary, and dangerously prone to fires. Families shared tiny spaces. Infrastructure was failing. Social tension was growing. Lee personally visited these areas and decided the situation couldn't continue. The problem was money. Singapore was poor. Large-scale public housing seemed unrealistic, but Lee pushed forward anyway. The government launched an aggressive housing plan through the Housing Development Board. Apartments were built rapidly, block after block, at a pace few countries had ever attempted. And here's what made it different. People weren't just given homes, they were given ownership. Through the Central Provident Fund, workers were required to save a portion of their income. Those savings could then be used to purchase their government-built apartments. Families gained stability, citizens gained assets, and the government recovered funds to build even more housing. Home ownership tied people's futures directly to the nation's success. Within a single generation, slums were replaced with organized neighborhoods. Stability replaced uncertainty, and Singapore took another step away from collapse and closer to transformation.
Watch out, coming through.
The housing strategy did something even more powerful than providing shelter. It created long-term security. With mandatory savings built into the system, nearly every working citizen accumulated retirement funds alongside home ownership. It was social policy and economic planning rolled into one. By the early 1980s, more than 80% of Singapore's population lived in government-built apartments, and most of them owned their homes. Few countries in the world have ever achieved anything close to that level of ownership and stability. But Lee Kuan Yew knew physical infrastructure alone wouldn't secure the future. Education would.
Try this one right here.
Singapore had no oil, no mines, no farmland.
That's it. Very good.
If the country was going to compete globally, its people had to become its most valuable asset. That meant educating everyone, not just the elite. At the time, many citizens were illiterate. Instead of lowering expectations, the government raised them. Schools were built rapidly. Teacher training was expanded. Education became compulsory and serious. Language posed another challenge. Singapore was home to Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, each with different mother tongues. Choosing one risked dividing the nation. The solution was English. English would serve as a neutral bridge between ethnic groups and connect Singapore directly to global commerce. Students would learn English alongside their native languages, becoming bilingual by design. This approach sparked controversy. Critics accused Lee of weakening local culture. But Lee was focused on decades ahead, not immediate applause. The final pillar was survival itself. In 1965, Singapore had almost no military capacity. Larger neighbors surrounded the island. If conflict ever came, Singapore couldn't rely on distance or size for protection, so it relied on deterrence. The strategy was simple: make any attack unbearably costly. Singapore introduced mandatory national service. Every able-bodied male citizen was required to serve in the armed forces. The population would be trained, disciplined, and ready. An invasion wouldn't be easy, it would be painful. Over time, the Singapore Armed Forces became one of the most capable militaries in Southeast Asia, equipped with modern systems and rigorous training. The message was clear. Singapore might be small, but it would not be weak. And here's the remarkable part. Every one of these policies worked. By the 1970s, global corporations began pouring into Singapore. The port expanded rapidly. Manufacturing grew. Financial services followed. Economic growth surged into double digits year after year. What was once dismissed as a doomed island was quietly becoming a global powerhouse. And the world was starting to notice.